Greetings everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. My name is Karaitiana Taiuru from the New Zealand Māori Internet Society. We're an ALS of Aotearoa. I've been given 5 to 7 minutes to discuss issues that could take hours to explain and many more hours to debate and discuss. So this is rather rushed and very high level. It could be argued that ICANN have created a potential for a global digital divide with the new GTLD program, and that it may offer a high risk of infringing on cultural and economic rights for Indigenous peoples' intellectual property by entrepreneurs and multinational corporates. Currently, the guidebook only allows anyone with enough money to purchase and protect their brand and identity, including city and geographic names. But little consideration is given for Indigenous peoples, cultural groups to have the same protection for their brand and identity. Now, I've been asked to address 3 questions. First question, what's the consumer public interest concerns in relation to the new GTLD program? Now, I have to go into a bit of background here first. Now, it's a common fact that domain names command high economic value and are often referred to as virtual real estate. The non-financial benefits of domain names are the facts that Indigenous peoples and cultural groups can use domain names as a virtual identity to promote their language, culture, identity, intellectual property rights, all of which in turn raise the social and economic status in their physical communities. Now, it's also a vehicle to bring the physical community to the virtual community and to create a virtual identity that reflects their physical identity and protection mechanisms to its people. Now, Indigenous TLD, GTLD, and CCTLD issues are nothing new, and historically, Indigenous peoples of North America have made cases to the late Dr. John Pastel and ICANN for the creation of a sponsored Indigenous GTLD.NAA for North American Aboriginal. Now, the new GTLD book seems to ignore all of these issues I just mentioned. Here, I must also acknowledge the work of Eric Brunner-Williams of NALO and the many others who have already raised these issues in the past and have been in discussion within the various hierarchy of ICANN. In 2009, we had talks were happening around the creation of a new GTLD.Indigi, which would have been a GTLD for Indigenous peoples of the world to help them ascertain self-sovereignty within their own identifiers on a cost basis. Now, the key message that we received from these talks was a global Indigenous problem is occurring and is being ignored by the likes of ICANN. Generic names. There's no protection preventing cultural groups and Indigenous peoples' collective names from being registered. Examples .Indian, .Pacific, .Maori, Apache, Comanche, etc. Some of which we're already seeing being registered in the first round of new GTLDs, including .Zulu. The issue here is who has the right to claim the identity of an Indigenous group for the purpose of a GTLD. At the moment, there appears to be very little protection. Now, if a commercial entity were to register an Indigenous name as a GTLD, this would remove the very last option for Indigenous identity in the DNS. You know, we've already seen how this can occur with .Patagonia, which was, the issue was raised in the GAC, and it's highly likely that an Indigenous name would never be noticed if it was also being raised. Indigenous peoples have issues with CCTLDs, despite the fact that sovereign nations and many other Indigenous peoples were the first inhabitants in their countries of residence. Many Indigenous peoples, were colonised. So, in relation to CCTLDs, this means that Indigenous peoples are bound by the RFC 1591, which prevents Indigenous peoples who live in a colonised homeland from being recognised. The other issue, prior to countries being colonised, Indigenous peoples had their own names for their countries, and these names are likely to be in use within the Indigenous population now. Such as in New Zealand, the native name for New Zealand is Aotearoa, and it's commonly used in the dual as Aotearoa New Zealand. Now, it's also often argued that Indigenous peoples can use this space within their own CCTLD. But this has only occurred with 2 Indigenous groups, native sovereign nations and Māori. For at least Māori, this is a time-consuming and very expensive process that only meets a minority of the identified issues. Despite Māori being an official language of New Zealand, and the fact that the New Zealand government are bound by a treaty to ensure equal rights and Indigenous protections are in place and afforded to Māori. This does exclude the DNS, as it's not governed by the New Zealand government. So the new GTLD process doesn't consider any of those previous issues in regards to Indigenous names of countries and places. The second question I've been asked to address is, are the policies and mechanisms that have been developed to address these concerns adequate? There doesn't appear to be any consideration of Indigenous rights within the disputes mechanisms in the GTLD process. The third question I was asked to address is, what more needs to be done to address these concerns effectively? I would suggest that an Indigenous cultural group representation needs to be heard throughout all of ICANN structure. An Indigenous review team needs to be established to review the GTLD guidebook to ensure global Indigenous issues are considered in all aspects of the new GTLD process. An Indigenous rights review of the rights protection mechanisms is undertaken. A pool of Indigenous experts to consult and consider Indigenous rights. Linguist issues of Indigenous languages needs to be considered. Already we have an issue of a Polynesian language that uses a glottal stop, who can't use the glottal stop in IDNs, nor will they be able to use them within any proposed GTLDs. ICANN could adopt or even adapt the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights and be a better global citizen. And finally, perhaps ALAC could create an Indigenous working group to address these issues. Thank you for your time.